Hi, this is Rhonda Cuning again, and I'm doing the second of my series on file folders, manila file folders that I'm making into an art journal. I put some holes in and tied some polyester thread through, and I'm just sealing up the holes with some paper tape. I put the previous one together and just put one little bit of paper tape so that it won't move while I'm painting. A little bit of Mars Black in my gesso to put down as my base coat, and I just slathered it on with my palette knife, trying to keep all the streaks horizontal. And I'm making a mixture of impasto gel, cadmium orange, red oxide and Mars Black. And this is a brick pen stencil that I'm using to make the brick patterns with. And I've lined it up so it's straight along the manila folder. And after that's dry, I can then line up the stencil on the previous parts to add the titanium white to it, so that it looks like the paint has come off the bricks. Well, that was the effect I was after anyway. And the rest I'm just slathering on with a palette knife again, because it's quick and easy and you don't get brush marks. And that is that. Now I'm painting on some colour, and those colours are Indian yellow, cadmium red and ultramarine blue, and I'm trying to keep the colour fairly pale, and I've also got some white in there. That's what I've lightened it with, some titanium white. And the yellow sort of slides off the white, so I end up having to go over that again, but that's alright. And I'm just blocking in some coloured areas. I'm not overly concerned whether it's blended or anything, it's just to put some colour down, because I go over it with several things. And that's me adding another layer of the yellow to make that yellow a bit denser. Now I go over the whole lot with some transparent gesso to give it some tooth, because the acrylic paints don't hold any sort of drawing or anything. And this is my first attempt at making a stencil. And yeah, I start out with some cellophane and a scalpel. And with all that, I figure it's going to be a pain. And I've seen Imperfect Impulses use a soldering iron to make a stencil with. I can't remember what he was actually using. I think he used laminate plastic, but I tried it out on the cellophane and it works fairly well. But you really shouldn't do this on your self-healing mat, because it doesn't heal from burns very well, and I ended up with the paper actually glued to the mat. But never mind, I ended up with a stencil that I was fairly happy with. I wasn't going for overly accurate, I just wanted the gist of the impression of the thinker there, and I just tested it out and I'm happy with that. So on I go, and using the pencil to rough in where I want the letters to be that I'm putting in. And that's where I had to put the transparent gesso on, because you just can't draw over the top of acrylic paint successfully without gouging into it. And this stuff is liquid glaze. It has a lot of names. It comes in, and it's an acrylic glazing medium, basically gives a really high gloss finish, and I'm using it as a resist, writing in the words from Phillippians 4 verse 8, which basically says whatever is good, pure, just, commendable, lovely, praiseworthy, excellent, think on these things, and I've written the things that you should be thinking about, well, I should be thinking about anyway, on there. And these are watercolour pencils, and I'm just using a bit of water on my brush and taking the colour straight from the pencil because it gives a darker impact to give a bit of contrast around where I've glazed. Of course the glaze is dry now, you can't do it when it's wet. And I'm using a darker colour so that the glaze will show up as light because of the light paint behind it. And I'm varying the colours that I'm using so that it will stand out. And some colours are more successful than others. The greater the difference, the better the contrast, the more it stands out. But I didn't want it to be overly obvious at the end, I wanted it to be fairly subtle. And you can see the letters starting to take shape. And because I've used that transparent gesso, the watercolour sticks to it. Whereas if I'd gone straight over with the acrylic paint, the watercolour would have just slid off and would have been a pain to work with. And just going over, trying to get more contrast and rubbing off the paint with my finger off the glazed areas so that I can tell whether it's a strong enough contrast, because the watercolour won't stick to the gloss. And just another sort of watercolour that I've used, and rubbing off there, and you can see there it's still subtle, but yeah, it's dark enough. And now I'm making up the letters with some black, it's Mars black if you want to be precise, so that it looks like someone spray painted the wall. That was the effect I was after anyway. And because I'm using acrylic paint over the top, then I can use other medium that won't stick to the acrylic to further contrast. I'll show you that in a minute, and you'll see that I'm making whatever is. And I used a variety of different letter shapes and sizes just to give it interest and to make it look more like graffiti. And yeah, quite happy with the way that's shown up. I had to draw in the letters first because otherwise when I wrote in the words I may have written where I wanted to put the black, so there's a little bit of planning involved in this page. I probably should have done that R a tad different, but it's alright, still looks like an R. And there is the is. And just touching up and doing my think cloud. I just used a small brush. I could have used a texture for this part, but I decided I had the brush out, so I might as well use it. Now these are pastel pencils. I love them, they're so easy to use, and as I've used the transparent gesso, it still has quite a bit of tooth on there that I can put the pencils on there and it wipes off the black acrylic paint really easily, whereas if I had have done the pastel pencils before the black paint, when I added the black paint it would have been muddied by the pastel pencils, so that's why I did it in that order. and it just makes it that little bit brighter. It gives it a little bit more pop. And then I use a little bit of white as well, just to highlight. My fingers get very dirty when I'm using pastels because I tend to use my fingers to smudge, and then I try and use a different finger for each colour so that I don't muddy up the colours. So hence I've got a tissue there to try and keep my fingers somewhat clean. And this is where I'm using the white, just to highlight certain areas. And this is a wet white that I'm using to clear the pastel off the acrylic black acrylic paint, however you want to say it, and that just clears it up, no problem at all. And now I want that think cloud to be white, and because it's all titanium white, I'm greying off the white that's around it by adding some grey watercolour paint over the whole lot. And as I said before, I've used clear gesso over the whole lot, so the watercolour paint will stick to it fairly well. And I'm also using a black around the edges just to frame it in a bit, and smudging that around with my wet wipe. And now that's dry, I'm doing my stenciling, and that is just some Mars black that I'm using. Now I've printed up the verse I'm using just as a guide, because otherwise I'm not good at remembering verses, and that's one of the reasons why I do the art journaling, is to help me remember. And I'm just going over that cloud in titanium white to make it stand out and look like someone's spray painted it white. And I'm quite happy with the way that looks. And because I've missed some of those stencil bits, I'm just fixing it up with some black paint and a fine brush. Probably could have just painted the whole thing, but hey, as it turns out, it probably would have been quicker for me to paint the whole thing. But still, I now know how to stencil, and I now know that if it's a simple stencil, I should just paint it. And that's just the reference there. I know it's not the whole reference. I should have put Phillippians, because I realise now that Phil actually is short also for Philemon, but hey, I thought Phil looked like somebody had signed it, so I wanted that double meaning in there. And just signing it down the bottom, and that's it. It's done. Now to separate it all. The baking paper makes a good backing paper, and the paint actually glued it together so well I had to use the scalpel to separate it, and I was being very careful not to cut the threads that I'd sewn in and painted with the paint. But they're still there, and they're still in loops, so that I can bind it together with a ribbon through the loops at the end. And that is the finished thing. I did spray that previous page with spray enamel and some silicone spray, some WD-40, so that the next layer of paint wouldn't stick. And I hope you like it. Have a go yourself. It's really not that hard. I'd recommend following someone else's method for stenciling, but have fun.